glad that you made it here today for our first official adult forum of 2012. We are going to be doing a series this January. As you heard if you were in church earlier this morning or have read in your newsletter, our theme for 2012 is creating a place for all to
worship.
Excellent. Creating a place for all to worship. And our goal for the year is to do a lot of going deep and having lots of interesting conversations. My guess is the total number of services you've attended in your life, worship services, is combined in this room, numbering in the millions, I'm sure. You are faithful churchgoers. But our hope is that as we take some time this month and explore some of the elements of worship, things that you may have already known or maybe didn't know will come to light, and you'll understand a little better why we do some of the things we do, why we may or may not continue doing some of those things, and how all of us together bring lots of opinions and ideas about what really good worship means. This week we're going to talk about the lectionary, our scheduled set of Bible readings and where our scriptures come from. And over the course of an hour today, you might learn a thing or two about some history. I'll be asking you to do just a little talking with one another, but not too much. Don't get nervous. We get a little nervous. That would be okay. And then at the end, we'll just kind of open it up for some questions and talk about that. Next week, I would invite you to come back. Bob Brusick, who is the seminary pastor emeritus from Lutheran Seminary, will be here to talk with us about Lutheran liturgy and what that means. And again, it's something that you may have sung through lots of it millions of times in your life, but where it comes from, what it means, and how our liturgy shapes who we are as Lutherans in worship will be covered next week. But today we're going to talk about the lectionary and get a little bit of a sense of what it comes from as we create a place in our worship services for altar worship. So I want to start with just a few definitions. The lectionary is, anybody know? None of the answers on the board. The lectionary is a set of readings that help set forth our church year. It's a scheduled set that reads texts that are chosen in advance, and they follow the life of the year of the church. Go ahead, Harlan. This is the brain of people who create these things. The Lutheran church year, and generally the Protestant and Christian church year, follows a cycle from the beginning of the season of Advent as we prepare for Christ's coming, through Christmas, through Epiphany and Lent and Holy Week and Easter, this festival sense. And it's designed to give us a sense of Christ's life and Christ's ministry as well. And you can see by the different color codings, it helps us learn about the different parts of the year that the church is in. And for each one of those, my writing is too little, but there are set Sundays and then lessons that go along with those. And these are the lectionary readings so that we can know, and if you have internet and you want to look it up, what's coming in advance. Go ahead to the next one, Harlan. And then the second half of the church year, you can see the season of Easter and the long season of Pentecost, where we talk about Jesus' ministry. So over the course of the year, when you go from Advent through till the end of the church year, you get a picture of what Christ has done and is doing, and what we as the people are doing, and how it ties in with our lives. So when we talk about lectionary, that's what we mean. The readings from the Bible that help us understand the flow of that church year. You may also be familiar with the term pericope. That's on the next slide, Harlan. Pericope is a word that you might hear if you grew up Catholic. It's used more in the Catholic settings, and it just means a selection from a biblical book, from the Greek word peri for section and koptein to cut. So if you grew up and hear that word, think of pericope and lectionary as being somewhat interchangeable, not too much different. When we talk about the lectionary year, we talk about a rotating year, year A, year B, and year C. And those years are designed to focus on a specific gospel. Year A is the gospel year of Matthew, where all of the gospel lessons, or the majority of them, will come from Matthew. Year B, the year we're in right now, have lots of lessons from the gospel of Mark. And year C is from the gospel of Luke. Now, what about the gospel of John? When do we read that? Well, kind of whenever the lectionary devisers wanted to figure that out. Lots of John is read in the book in the year B, the year of Mark, partly because Mark is shorter, but there are certain texts of John that show up elsewhere to go along with specific days of the church year. Because John is so very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels. It's designed to help us have kind of a bigger picture of what God is up to, and we read that along the way, especially in Advent and Christmas and Lent. Two more definitions I want to put out there. One is semi-continuous, and you may occasionally hear about that as being a form of reading from the Old Testament that kind of goes from one lesson to the next. They kind of flow together. And then the narrative lectionary, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is a newer way of reading the Bible, seeing it as one big connected story designed to help you see what God is doing and putting it together. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So where did the lectionary come from? Was it handed down from God? It'd be kind of nice if it were. It would make it much easier. Actually, when we talk about a set idea of readings that follow a pattern, this isn't a new idea. All the way back in Jewish tradition, Jewish worship is generally centered around two different readings. One was a reading from the Torah, the law, and every time they gathered, they would read something from the Torah. And then the other was the Haftarah, which was a word from the prophets that was designed to stand next to the Torah reading. So when Jews gathered for worship, that's what they were used to, a reading from the Torah and a reading from the Haftarah. And that's exactly what was happening in Jesus' day. You remember there's a story in Luke chapter 4 where Jesus is come back and he's drawn into a worship setting, and he comes and is called forth. And it says Jesus was given a scroll. The scroll was part of the prescribed reading for the day. And when Jesus received it, he took it. It was a scroll from the book of Isaiah. And we don't know whether he had set verses. Probably not. But he found verses from that book of Isaiah. And he read to the people. And then he began to preach. Jesus is a lectionary preacher. He preaches from the text that he has been given. And that's the idea when we take a look at a prescribed set of readings, that these are texts that we have been given from God, not texts that we choose willy-nilly depending upon our mood, but that Jesus and preachers today who use the lectionary go about their preaching because God has given them these texts. Well, in early Christian worship, as the church began to develop, of course, when they gathered, they would continue to read Scripture. And they would read, as it developed, correspondence, letters from Paul or letters from other apostles or other travelers. As the Gospels came to be written, they would read from the Gospels as they had them available. Understandably, it was pretty inconsistent. There wasn't Google where you could pull up your handy-dandy little color chart and figure out what you were supposed to read. Not everyone had copies of any of the biblical books. They weren't available at Barnes & Noble. But there was some sense that when we gather for worship, part of our goal for gathering is to hear a word from God. And that word comes from the Old Testament. It comes from what God's people are doing through the epistles, through the letters, and most importantly, it comes through the story of Jesus. And that's where they would begin. Generally, in the early church, they read what was called Lectio Continua, meaning start at the beginning and you just keep reading through the book until it's done. And depending upon how the reader was moved or depending upon what was happening, they could read a couple of chapters, they could read the whole book. The point was for the people to hear the words of Scripture. Now by the 4th century, there was a little bit of a change. It came with the development of the church year. This chart that we talked about that had all the different fancy colors on it. The church year began to develop as people started seeing this sense of what was happening. Churches would celebrate the festival of Easter. This was the reason for coming together, believing that Christ was raised. And so they celebrated Easter. And then they began to celebrate this festival of Pentecost, when the Spirit came and was delivered. And then as it developed, some sense of preparing to celebrate Christ's death. The season of Lent developed. And then the season of Epiphany developed. And so right around the 4th century, this festival half of the church year was pretty much set. And the sense that we need to read our texts that tell the story and help prepare us for what's coming next began to come about. And there were standard texts that were read in churches for Christmas and for Lent and for Easter. Now around 770, Charlemagne decided, he was in charge of everything, that he was going to create standardized liturgical practices in his domain. He wrote a memo, he sent it out, and said, we want worship to look the same in one church as the next. And when you're Charlemagne and you have this kind of authority, it's a way of asserting your control and making sure that people understand the proper hierarchy and know where their place is and know that lots of others are in your place too. There was also apparently some sense that worship went on a little long. And the goal was to make worship services a little bit shorter. So one of the ways that they standardized the service was to create a set list of readings. And they eliminated the readings from the Old Testament. They cut the epistles to a manageable length. So instead of reading the whole book of 1 Corinthians, say, you would read a chapter, or maybe two. And they took the Gospels that were available, and they started saying, we're going to read this particular story from the Gospel of Luke, or this particular parable from Matthew, or this particular teaching from John, instead of just reading the Gospel text. Now, some of this may have been because people weren't reading. There was incredibly low rates of literacy, so it wasn't as though folks had Bibles that they could read. Frankly, it wasn't as though the people who were the clergy, the learned folks who were leading worship, were necessarily all that literate either. And so making something that was manageable became a way for the worship service to start teaching and feeding the people in a way that they could understand. Now, part of the reason was also to remind folks, we have a strong monarchy, a strong papacy. The learned people, the clergy, the kings, the pope, are the people who need to know what's happening with God. You people, come. We shall bless you, and you shall go. But the concept of really digging deep into Bible study wasn't what was happening there. There was much more that sense of let's be united as God's people in God's kingdom. During the Reformation, the lectionary wasn't an issue. Martin Luther didn't necessarily find there to be anything false teachings that were going on. He was much more concerned with what was happening in the church. But he did have an opinion about the lectionary. I'm going to pull that quote up. Luther wrote in his volume on liturgy and hymns, he said, those parts of the epistle of Paul in which faith are taught are read only rarely, while the exhortations to morality are read more frequently. The epistles seem to have been chosen by a singularly unlearned and superstitious advocate of works. In the meantime, he said, the sermon will have to supply what is lacking. Luther understood the point of preaching is to help the word to come alive. And obviously he had his own biases for what the Bible readings were for. But his goal was that when we read Scripture and hear Scripture, it should be not to teach us how to live, but to build faith and help us understand what God has done for us.